This was supposed to be the rifle that made war easier to survive. Instead, in Korea, soldiers began throwing it away in the middle of battle. They said they were hitting the enemy at point-blank range, and nothing was happening. So how did the most produced American weapon of World War II become the rifle that men stopped trusting? At first glance, the M1 Carbine looked like the perfect weapon for a new kind of war. Because the United States Army was no longer fighting slow, static battles, but a global conflict that demanded speed, mobility, and a firearm that could be carried by men who were never supposed to be frontline infantry in the first place. And what they wanted was something light, something compact, something that could give a radio man, a truck driver, or a paratrooper more firepower than a pistol without forcing him to carry the full weight of a battle rifle across entire continents. What they got was a rifle that weighed barely over 5 pounds, held 15 rounds, fired as fast as you could pull the trigger, and could be produced in numbers so massive that it would become the most manufactured American small arm of the entire Second World War. A weapon built not only by legendary gun companies, but by typewriter manufacturers, jukebox makers, and even IBM, which somehow found itself producing hundreds of thousands of combat rifles in factories that had never before built a firearm. It sounded like a miracle of modern industry, and in many ways it was, because over 6 million of these carbines would eventually be made, placed into the hands of soldiers across Europe and the Pacific, carried through jungles, dropped into occupied territory with paratroopers in the middle of the night, and praised by some of the most famous combat veterans of the war, including Audie Murphy, who called his carbine his lucky rifle, and preferred it over the heavier M1 Garand, because in the chaos of close combat, its lightweight and fast handling kept him alive. But the story of the M1 Carbine does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in a prison workshop, with a man who was serving time for killing a deputy sheriff. David Marshall Williams was not supposed to become part of American military history, and yet inside a North Carolina prison, working with basic tools and scrap metal, he began experimenting with firearm mechanisms and developing a short-stroke gas piston system that would later become one of the key features associated with the carbine's design. And the contrast between his past and the weapon that would arm millions of American soldiers created a legend that Hollywood would later turn into a film, transforming a convicted murderer into a symbol of wartime ingenuity. By the time the weapon was officially adopted in October 1941, the United States was on the edge of entering the war. And within months, the first carbines were being issued to troops who immediately fell in love with how easy they were to carry. Because compared to the long and heavy Garand, the little carbine felt almost weightless. And for support troops who were not expected to engage in sustained firefights, it seemed like the perfect balance between a pistol and a full-power rifle. In the Pacific, where combat often took place at close range in dense jungle, the carbine earned a reputation as a fast, handy weapon that gave American troops a massive advantage in mobility. And senior commanders would later credit it as one of the tools that helped the United States fight across thousands of miles of ocean and island. Because a lighter rifle meant more ammunition, more movement, and more endurance in climates that destroyed both men and equipment. But even during World War II, there were warning signs that something was wrong. Paratroopers in Sicily began reporting that the weapon did not always perform the way they expected in real combat. And frontline infantry who had access to the heavier M1 Garand often chose to carry the extra weight rather than rely on the smaller rifle. Because when your life depended on stopping an enemy soldier immediately, confidence in your weapon mattered more than comfort. The problem was not that the carbine was useless, because in the role it had been designed for, a defensive weapon for support troops, it worked exactly as intended. But war has a way of forcing weapons into roles they were never meant to fill. And the M1 Carbine was increasingly being used as a frontline combat rifle against enemies who were determined, heavily clothed, often charging at close range, and sometimes willing to keep fighting even after being hit multiple times. Nothing would damage the Carbine's reputation more than the frozen mountains of Korea. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, thousands of carbines that had been built for the warm climates of World War II were pulled out of storage and issued to troops fighting in temperatures so cold that lubricants froze, metal contracted, and weapons that had once functioned perfectly began to slow down, jam, or fail to cycle properly. And soldiers who had trusted the light rifle now found themselves in night battles against mass infantry assaults, pulling the trigger and hearing a weapon that responded sluggishly or not at all. And then there were the stories that spread through the ranks, the kind that destroy morale faster than enemy fire. Because men began to say that they had shot charging enemy soldiers at close range and watched them keep coming. That they had emptied magazines into heavy winter clothing and seen no immediate effect. And whether every one of those stories was true or not mattered less than the fact that the soldiers believed them. Because once confidence in a weapon is gone, the weapon itself becomes a liability. Some units began issuing quiet, unofficial orders to aim for the head. Others simply replaced the carbine with heavier rifles whenever they could find them. So was the M1 Carbine a revolutionary weapon? Or a rifle that was simply used in the wrong war? If you know this rifle and you have your own opinion, write it in the comments. And if you want a second part about the M1 Carbine, where we go deeper into the real combat reports and battlefield stories, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.